Detective Sarah Chen pulled her Honda Civic into the gravel parking lot of Cornerstone Baptist Church on Peachtree Industrial Boulevard, the morning sun casting long shadows across the weathered brick facade. The scaffolding around the bell tower looked like steel bones against the Georgia sky, and the sound of power tools echoed off the surrounding pine trees. She'd been called here by a restoration worker who discovered something that made his hands shake when he dialed 911. What they'd found behind a false wall in the bell tower would crack open a mystery that had haunted Atlanta's North Side for nearly 5 decades. The church had stood on this corner since 1952, its red brick darkened by decades of southern humidity and summer storms. Sarah remembered the headlines from 1977 when she was just 12 years old and living in Marietta with her parents. 7 children from the Cornerstone Baptist Sunday School had simply vanished on a crisp October morning during their weekly Bible study. No trace, no witnesses, no explanation. The case had consumed the Atlanta Police Department for months, generated hundreds of tips, and spawned conspiracy theories that still circulated on internet forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries. Now, at 47, Sarah had been with the DeKalb County Major Case Squad for 18 years. She'd seen enough missing persons cases to know that children didn't just evaporate into thin air. Someone always knew something. Someone always left evidence behind. The problem was finding it after time had buried the truth under layers of fear, shame, and deliberately constructed silence. She walked across the parking lot, her low heels clicking against the asphalt, and approached the cluster of workers standing near the tower's base. The foreman, a weathered man in his 60s wearing a hard hat marked Pinnacle Restoration, stepped forward with the nervous energy of someone who'd seen something he wished he hadn't. "Detective Chen? I'm Bobby Cartwright. I called this morning." His voice carried the slight tremor of shock wearing off. "We were pulling out the old insulation behind the tower wall, checking for structural damage, when we found, well, you need to see it yourself." Sarah looked up at the bell tower, its white-painted wooden frame rising 60 feet above the main church building. The restoration project had been funded by a memorial gift from the family of former pastor Reverend James Whitfield, who died 6 months earlier. The irony wasn't lost on her. Whitfield had been the pastor when the children disappeared, and his death had prompted the church board to finally renovate the aging structure. "How long have you been working on this project?" she asked, pulling out her notebook. "Started 3 weeks ago. We've been focusing on the exterior first, but yesterday we got permission to check the internal framework. That's when we found the access panel." Bobby gestured toward a narrow opening in the tower's wooden siding, about 20 feet up. "It's not on any of the original blueprints we have. Someone added it later." Sarah studied the tower's construction. The main church building was solid brick, but the bell tower had been built with a wooden frame and siding, cheaper and easier to modify. "What exactly did you find behind the panel?" Bobby's face paled slightly. "Personal items, children's things, and—" He paused, swallowing hard. "There's something else. Something that looks like it might be human remains." The words hit Sarah like cold water. She'd worked dozens of cold cases, but finding physical evidence after 47 years was almost unheard of. Most missing persons cases from the 1970s had been investigated with technology and methods that seemed primitive by today's standards. No DNA analysis, limited forensic capabilities, and police departments that often treated missing children as runaways unless there was obvious evidence of foul play. "Have you touched anything inside the space?" "No, ma'am. Soon as we saw what was in there, we backed out and called you. Only people who've been up there are me and my partner, Jake Morrison. We've been doing restoration work for 23 years. We know not to disturb potential evidence." Sarah called for the crime scene unit and the medical examiner, then arranged for the church to be cleared of all personnel except essential restoration workers. While she waited, she walked around the building's perimeter, studying the tower's relationship to the main structure. The bell tower was accessible through a narrow staircase that led up from the church's choir loft, but it also had external maintenance access points that would have been much less visible to anyone inside the building. The church sanctuary was empty, except for rows of wooden pews facing a simple altar area. Afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows depicting biblical scenes: Jesus with children, the Good Shepherd, the Sermon on the Mount. Sarah had attended Baptist churches as a child, and the familiar smell of old wood and hymnal pages brought back memories of Sunday mornings in scratchy dresses and patent leather shoes. She found the door leading to the choir loft and climbed the narrow stairs to the tower access. The wooden steps creaked under her weight, and she could hear the sound of wind moving through the tower's frame above. The staircase ended at a heavy wooden door marked Bell Tower Authorized Personnel Only. The door opened into a cramped space filled with rope mechanisms for the church bell, electrical conduits, and decades of accumulated dust. The crime scene technicians arrived 40 minutes later, led by Maria Santos, a forensic specialist Sarah had worked with on several previous cases. Maria was methodical and patient, qualities that had helped solve cases where evidence had been compromised or degraded by time. "What's the timeline on this space?" Maria asked, pulling on latex gloves and adjusting her camera equipment. The tower was built in 1952, same as the main building. The children disappeared in October 1977. The restoration crew found the false panel yesterday, but it's not on any original blueprints. Maria nodded and began photographing the tower space before examining the concealed panel. The opening was approximately 3 feet by 4 feet, cut into the wooden siding with precision that suggested someone familiar with construction techniques. The panel itself had been designed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding wood, held in place by hidden hinges and a latch mechanism that would have been nearly impossible to detect from the outside. "Whoever did this knew what they were doing," Maria observed, carefully removing the panel and setting it aside. "This isn't amateur work." Behind the panel was a narrow space running along the tower's interior wall, about 2 feet deep and 8 feet long. The space was dark and musty, filled with the smell of old wood and something else, something organic and unsettling. Maria directed her flashlight into the opening, and Sarah could see the outline of objects arranged along the wooden floor. "I need to document everything in place before we remove anything," Maria said. "This is going to take several hours." Sarah called Detective Lieutenant Rick Morrison, her supervisor, to brief him on the discovery. Morrison had been with the department for 28 years and remembered the original investigation. "Jesus Christ, Sarah, you think this is connected to the missing kids? 7 children disappear from this church in 1977. Now we find a hidden space in the bell tower with children's belongings and possible human remains. I'd say the connection is pretty obvious." "What do you need from me?" "I need the original case files, everything we have. I need to contact the families and let them know we're reopening the investigation. And I need to track down everyone who was associated with the church in 1977, staff, volunteers, congregation members." That's a lot of people to interview after 47 years. The ones who are still alive, anyway. Someone knew what happened to those children, Rick. Someone has been living with this secret for nearly 5 decades. Sarah spent the next 2 hours watching Maria and her team carefully document and remove items from the hidden space. The objects were heartbreaking in their mundane specificity. A small red shoe, child-sized, a Mickey Mouse watch with a broken band, a wooden ruler marked Atlanta Public Schools, a small Bible with a name inscribed in careful cursive, Rebecca Ann Martinez, age 8. Rebecca Martinez had been one of the 7 missing children. The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Hendricks, arrived as the team was finishing their initial documentation. She was a small, precise woman in her 50s who'd built a reputation for extracting information from deteriorated remains. Sarah had worked with her on several cold cases, and she trusted Patricia's ability to find answers in situations where evidence had been compromised by time. "What are we looking at?" Patricia asked, studying the items laid out on evidence sheets. "Personal belongings from children who disappeared in 1977. And there's something else." Maria pointed to the back corner of the hidden space, where her flashlight had revealed what appeared to be skeletal remains wrapped in a deteriorated blanket. Patricia pulled on gloves and carefully examined the remains without disturbing them. "This is definitely human, and given the size, almost certainly a child. I'll need to get everything back to the lab for proper analysis, but preliminary examination suggests these remains have been here for decades." Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the emotional weight of finding a child's remains, even after so many years. She'd learned to compartmentalize these feelings, to focus on the investigation rather than the human tragedy, but it was never easy. "How long for DNA analysis?" If we can extract usable DNA, probably 2 weeks. But given the age and condition of the remains, it might not be possible. I'll also look for other identifying factors. Dental records, bone measurements, any evidence of trauma. The team worked until sunset, carefully removing every item from the hidden space and documenting its exact location. By the time they finished, Sarah had a preliminary inventory that included clothing items, toys, school supplies, and what appeared to be personal effects from all 7 missing children. That evening, Sarah drove to her apartment in Virginia Highland and spread the original case files across her dining room table. The investigation had been led by Detective Harold Brennan, who'd retired in 1992 and died of lung cancer 5 years later. His notes were meticulous but reflected the limitations of 1970s police work. No computer databases, no cell phone records, no social media trails to follow. The 7 missing children had been part of the Sunshine Sunday School class for ages 6 to 10. They'd been meeting in the church basement for their weekly Bible study when they vanished sometime between 9:30 and 10:15 a.m. on October 16, 1977. The class was taught by Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman, a 28-year-old woman who'd been attending Cornerstone Baptist for 3 years. According to the original witness statements, Mrs. Kellerman had left the children in the basement classroom around 9:45 a.m. to get supplies from the church office. When she returned 15 minutes later, the room was empty. The children's parents were notified, and by 11 a.m., the church was filled with frantic families searching the building and surrounding area. Sarah studied the photographs from the original investigation black and white images of the basement classroom, the church parking lot, the surrounding neighborhood. The basement had 2 exits, stairs leading to the main sanctuary, and a ground-level door that opened to the church's side parking area. Both exits were visible from multiple locations, making it nearly impossible for 7 children to leave unnoticed. The original investigation had focused on several theories: parental kidnapping by one of the divorced fathers, abduction by a stranger, or the possibility that the children had wandered off and become lost in the woods behind the church. Hundreds of volunteers had searched the surrounding area for days, but no trace of the children was ever found. Sarah pulled out the individual case files for each child. Rebecca Martinez, 8, lived with her mother and stepfather on Buford Highway. Timothy Chen, 7, was the son of Chinese immigrants who owned a restaurant in Doraville. Michael Johnson, 6, was the youngest, a quiet boy whose parents had moved to Atlanta from rural Georgia. Sarah Elizabeth Turner, 9, was the oldest, a bright girl who'd been skipped ahead a grade in school. David Williams, 8, lived with his grandmother after his parents died in a car accident. Jennifer Lee, 7, was the daughter of a Korean War veteran who worked at the Ford plant in Hapeville. Marcus Thompson, 8, was the son of a single mother who worked 2 jobs to support her family. 7 children from working-class families, all regular attendees at Cornerstone Baptist, all vanished without a trace on a Sunday morning in suburban Atlanta. The next morning, Sarah began the difficult process of contacting the families. Most of the parents were now in their 70s or 80s, and several had died in the intervening years. She started with Maria Santos Martinez, Rebecca's mother, who was now 79 and living in a senior care facility in Marietta. Maria Santos had never remarried after her husband's death in 1985. She'd spent the last 47 years wondering what happened to her daughter, participating in search efforts that gradually diminished over time, and dealing with the psychological trauma of losing a child under mysterious circumstances. "I knew someone would find them eventually," Maria said when Sarah called to explain about the discovery. Her voice was steady but carried the weight of decades of grief. "I always knew Rebecca didn't just run away. She was such a good girl, so responsible. She would never have left without telling someone." Sarah arranged to meet Maria at the care facility that afternoon. The building was a modern, well-maintained complex surrounded by landscaped gardens, but it couldn't mask the underlying sadness of a woman who'd spent nearly 5 decades waiting for answers about her daughter's fate. The information hit Sarah like a physical blow. Detective Harold Brennan, the lead investigator, had never mentioned in his reports that his brother had been at the church that morning. This was either a significant oversight or a deliberate omission, and either possibility raised serious questions about the original investigation. Did you ever mention this to anyone else? Any other police officers? I tried to, but Detective Brennan said his brother had been questioned and cleared. He said I was confused about the timeline, that Carl had been there earlier in the week, not that Sunday morning. Sarah felt the familiar tension that came with discovering potential police misconduct. If Detective Brennan had covered up his brother's presence at the church, it suggested either corruption or a family connection that had compromised the investigation. Mrs. Martinez, I need to ask you about something we found in the bell tower. We discovered personal items that belonged to the missing children, including a small Bible with Rebecca's name inscribed inside. Maria's composure finally cracked. Tears ran down her cheeks as she reached into her purse for a tissue. I gave her that Bible for her 8th birthday. She carried it to church every Sunday. She was so proud of it. We also found human remains. We're waiting for analysis to determine if they belong to Rebecca or one of the other children. After all these years, I thought I was prepared for this, Maria said. But knowing that someone hurt my baby and hid her body in the church, she couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah reached across the table and took Maria's hand. We're going to find out who did this, I promise you that. After leaving the care facility, Sarah drove to the DeKalb County Archives to research Carl Brennan's background. The maintenance worker had been mentioned in only one witness statement, and there was no record of him being formally interviewed or cleared. This was a significant gap in the original investigation. The archives contained employment records for the church dating back to 1952. Sarah found Carl Brennan's name on the payroll records for September and October 1977. He'd been hired as a temporary maintenance worker to repair the church's heating system before winter, and his last day of employment was October 15, 1977, the day before the children disappeared. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she read the personnel file. Carl Brennan had been 34 years old in 1977, unmarried, and living in a rented house on Cheshire Bridge Road. His previous employment had been sporadic short-term construction jobs, maintenance work, and a 6-month stint at a lumber yard that ended when he was fired for behavioral issues. More troubling was a notation in the file that Carl had been given access to all areas of the church building, including the basement classrooms and the bell tower. He'd been working alone most of the time, and several congregation members had complained about his strange behavior around children. Sarah called the phone number listed in the file, knowing it was a long shot after 47 years. The number had been disconnected, but she was able to trace it to a landlord who'd owned several rental properties in the area. The landlord, now in his 80s, remembered Carl Brennan clearly. Oh, that guy. Yeah, he was trouble from the start. Always seemed to be watching people, especially families with kids. He'd sit in his truck outside the elementary school sometimes, just watching. I had to evict him after a few months because neighbors were complaining. Do you know what happened to him after he left your property? No idea. Good riddance, if you ask me. There was something off about him, made people uncomfortable. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon researching Carl Brennan's background through public records, criminal databases, and genealogy websites. What she found painted a picture of a man who'd lived on the margins of society, moving frequently, working temporary jobs, and accumulating a series of minor criminal charges over the years. Carl Brennan had been arrested for public intoxication in 1978, trespassing in 1979, and disorderly conduct in 1981. In 1983, he'd been charged with loitering near a school playground, but the charges were dropped when he agreed to leave the county. After that, his trail went cold. Sarah was preparing to leave the archives when she made another disturbing discovery. Carl Brennan's brother, Detective Harold Brennan, had personally signed off on several of the incident reports involving Carl's arrests. In each case, the charges had been reduced or dismissed entirely. The pattern was clear. Detective Brennan had been protecting his brother for years, using his position within the police department to minimize Carl's legal troubles. This protection had continued right up until the children's disappearance, when Harold Brennan had been assigned to lead the investigation. Sarah drove home through Atlanta's rush-hour traffic, her mind racing with the implications of what she'd discovered. If Carl Brennan was responsible for the children's disappearance, and if his brother had covered it up, then the entire original investigation was compromised. 7 families had spent 47 years without answers because a police detective had protected his brother instead of seeking justice. That evening, Sarah called Dr. Patricia Hendricks to check on the progress of the forensic analysis. Patricia had been working with the remains and personal items found in the bell tower, and she had preliminary results. The remains are definitely from a child, probably around 8 years old based on bone measurements. I found evidence of trauma to the skull that would have been fatal. This child was murdered. Sarah felt her stomach clench. What kind of trauma? Blunt force trauma, consistent with being struck by a heavy object. The pattern suggests something like a hammer or crowbar. The injuries would have caused immediate death. Any other evidence? DNA, clothing fibers, anything that might help identify the perpetrator? I found some interesting microscopic evidence on the clothing items. Wood fibers that don't match the tower construction, and paint chips that appear to be from a vehicle. I'm running analysis on both. Sarah thanked Patricia and hung up the phone. She was sitting in her living room, surrounded by case files and photographs, when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. Detective Chen? This is Dorothy Kellerman. I heard about what you found at the church. Dorothy Kellerman was the Sunday school teacher who'd been with the children the morning they disappeared. Sarah had been planning to contact her, but apparently word was spreading through the community about the discovery. Mrs. Kellerman, I'd like to speak with you about the morning the children disappeared. Would you be available to meet tomorrow? I think there are some things you need to know, Dorothy said. Her voice was shaky, as if she were fighting back tears. Things I should have told the police 47 years ago. They arranged to meet the next morning at a coffee shop in Roswell. Sarah spent the evening reviewing Dorothy's original witness statements, looking for inconsistencies or details that might have been overlooked. According to the 1977 reports, Dorothy had been teaching the Sunshine Sunday School class for 6 months when the children disappeared. She told investigators that she left the children in the basement classroom around 9:45 a.m. to get craft supplies from the church office. When she returned 15 minutes later, the children were gone. Dorothy's statement had been consistent across multiple interviews, but Sarah noticed that she'd been unusually emotional during the questioning. The interviewing officer had noted that Dorothy seemed extremely distressed and had difficulty completing her sentences. At the time, this had been attributed to the shock of losing 7 children under her supervision. Sarah realized that Dorothy had been threatened into silence by Carl Brennan, and his brother's position in the police department had made the threat credible. What did you do? I watched him lead the children up the stairs to the main level. I waited about 10 minutes. Then I went upstairs and told everyone the children were missing. I've been living with that lie for 47 years. Why didn't you tell the truth when Detective Brennan interviewed you? Because Carl was right about his brother. During the interview, Detective Brennan made it clear that if I changed my story or said anything about Carl being there, I'd be charged with negligent homicide. He said no one would believe me, that I'd go to prison for the rest of my life. Sarah felt a surge of anger at the corruption that had allowed 7 children to be murdered, and their families to suffer for decades without answers. Mrs. Kellerman, I need you to make a formal statement about what you witnessed that morning. I'll do whatever you need. I should have spoken up years ago, but I was scared. I was young and scared, and I let those families suffer because I was a coward. You were a victim too, Sarah said. Carl Brennan and his brother manipulated you into staying silent. You're not responsible for what happened to those children. After taking Dorothy's statement, Sarah returned to the police station to brief Lieutenant Morrison on the developments. The corruption angle added a new dimension to the investigation, and they would need to involve internal affairs and possibly the FBI. Jesus Christ, Sarah! You're telling me that Harold Brennan covered up his brother's involvement in the disappearance of 7 children? That's exactly what I'm telling you. Carl Brennan was at the church that morning. He had access to all areas of the building, including the bell tower. And he threatened the Sunday school teacher into silence. Harold Brennan used his position to protect his brother and subvert the investigation. Morrison was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. Harold's been dead for 15 years. Carl Brennan is probably dead too. How do we prove any of this? We start by finding Carl Brennan. If he's still alive, we bring him in for questioning. If he's dead, we track down his associates, his former employers, anyone who might have information about his activities in 1977. What about the families? They have a right to know what we've discovered. I'll start making notifications this afternoon. They deserve to know that their children didn't just disappear, they were murdered by someone who should have been caught 47 years ago. Detective Harold Brennan had visited his brother regularly, probably to monitor what Carl might reveal in his deteriorating mental state. Even in death, Harold had been protecting his brother's secrets. Sarah returned to Atlanta with a clearer picture of what had happened in 1977, but also with the frustration of knowing that both perpetrator and enabler were beyond the reach of justice. The families deserved answers, but they would never see their children's killer face trial. Over the next week, Sarah contacted the families of all 7 missing children. The conversations were heartbreaking. Parents and siblings who'd spent decades wondering what happened to their loved ones, finally learning that their children had been murdered and their bodies hidden in the church where they'd gone to worship. Michael Johnson's father, Robert, was now 81 and living in a retirement community in Decatur. He'd never remarried after his wife died of cancer in 1993, and he'd spent the last 30 years volunteering with missing children organizations, hoping to help other families find the answers he'd never received. "I knew Michael didn't just run away," Robert said when Sarah called to tell him about the discovery. "He was 6 years old, barely out of kindergarten. He wouldn't have left without his teddy bear or his favorite blanket. I kept telling the police that, but they said children do unexpected things when they're scared or confused." The forensic analysis of the remains continued over the following weeks. Dr. Patricia Hendricks was able to extract DNA from bone samples, and the results confirmed that the remains found in the bell tower belonged to Rebecca Martinez. The other children's bodies had apparently been disposed of elsewhere, though their personal belongings suggested they'd all been taken to the tower at some point. Sarah coordinated with the medical examiner's office to arrange for Rebecca's remains to be released to her family for burial. Maria Santos Martinez had waited 47 years to lay her daughter to rest, and she chose a small cemetery in Marietta where Rebecca could be buried next to her father. The funeral was a small, private ceremony attended by Rebecca's surviving family members and a few close friends. Sarah stood at the back of the group, watching as a mother finally said goodbye to the daughter she'd lost nearly 5 decades earlier. After the service, Maria Santos approached Sarah with a small photo album. "These are pictures of Rebecca from when she was born until she disappeared. I want you to have them, so you'll remember her as she was, not just as a victim, but as a little girl who loved Sunday school and collecting leaves and helping her mother cook dinner." Sarah accepted the album with tears in her eyes. "I'll keep them safe, Mrs. Martinez, and I'll make sure Rebecca's story is told so that people remember her." The investigation into the other missing children continued, but without their bodies, the case remained technically open. Sarah worked with local authorities in surrounding counties to search for locations where Carl Brennan might have disposed of the other children's remains. The search focused on construction sites, abandoned buildings, and wooded areas where Brennan was known to have worked in the late 1970s. 3 months after the discovery in the bell tower, Sarah received a call from a detective in Gwinnett County. Construction workers renovating an old warehouse in Norcross had found children's remains buried in a concrete foundation. The building had been constructed in 1978, and employment records showed that Carl Brennan had worked on the project as a day laborer. The remains were those of 3 children, all approximately the same age as the missing Sunday school class. DNA analysis confirmed that they were Timothy Chen, Michael Johnson, and David Williams. The other 3 children, Sarah Turner, Jennifer Lee, and Marcus Thompson, were still missing. Sarah continued searching for the remaining children while working with the families to arrange proper burials for those who'd been found. Each funeral was a mixture of grief and relief grief for the children who died so young. Relief that their families finally had answers and a place to mourn. The case attracted national media attention, particularly the corruption angle involving Detective Harold Brennan. The Atlanta Police Department launched an internal investigation into other cases Brennan had worked, looking for patterns of evidence tampering or witness intimidation. They found several instances where Brennan had used his position to protect family members and associates from criminal prosecution. Sarah was promoted to lieutenant and assigned to head a new cold case task force focused on investigating unsolved crimes from the 1970s and 1980s. The success of the Cornerstone Baptist case had demonstrated the value of applying modern forensic techniques to old evidence. and the department was committed to providing closure to families who'd been waiting decades for answers. The church board at Cornerstone Baptist voted to install a memorial garden in honor of the 7 missing children. The garden was located in a quiet corner of the church property, with 7 small trees and a bronze plaque listing the children's names. Maria Santos Martinez was invited to speak at the dedication ceremony, and she chose to focus on forgiveness and healing rather than anger and revenge. "My daughter loved this church," Maria said to the gathered crowd. "She loved her Sunday school class, her teacher, and her friends. What happened to her here was evil, but this place was also where she learned about love, kindness, and faith. I want people to remember Rebecca and the other children not as victims, but as lights that shone brightly even in their short lives." Sarah continued working cold cases, but the Cornerstone Baptist investigation remained her most significant achievement. It demonstrated that even decades-old crimes could be solved with persistent investigation, modern forensic techniques, and the courage to confront corruption within law enforcement. 5 years after the discovery in the bell tower, Sarah received a call from a construction crew working on a highway expansion project in South Georgia. They'd found human remains while excavating an old bridge foundation, and initial analysis suggested the remains belonged to children from the 1970s. The remains were those of the final 3 missing children: Sarah Turner, Jennifer Lee, and Marcus Thompson. They'd been buried together in a remote location about 60 miles south of Atlanta, in an area where Carl Brennan had worked on bridge construction projects in 1978. With the discovery of the final 3 children, the case was finally closed. All 7 families had answers, all 7 children had been found, and all 7 could finally rest in peace. The investigation had taken 5 years and involved dozens of law enforcement professionals, but it had achieved something that had seemed impossible for 47 years. It had brought the children home. Sarah attended the final memorial service, a community gathering where all 7 families came together to honor their children's memory. The service was held at a non-denominational chapel in Atlanta, chosen because it was neutral ground where people of different faiths could gather without the painful associations of Cornerstone Baptist Church. Each family shared memories of their lost child, creating a portrait of 7 unique individuals who'd been robbed of their chance to grow up, go to school, fall in love, and have families of their own. Rebecca Martinez, who'd loved to draw pictures of flowers; Timothy Chen, who'd been learning to play the piano; Michael Johnson, who'd collected bottle caps and baseball cards; Sarah Turner, who'd been the best reader in her 3rd grade class; David Williams, who'd wanted to be a firefighter when he grew up; Jennifer Lee, who'd loved to dance and sing; Marcus Thompson, who'd been fascinated by airplanes and dreamed of becoming a pilot. After the service, Sarah walked through the memorial garden at Cornerstone Baptist Church. The 7 trees had grown taller over the years, their branches reaching toward the sky like prayers made manifest. The bronze plaque gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, reflecting the names of 7 children who'd been lost but never forgotten. Standing in the garden, Sarah reflected on the nature of justice and closure. Carl Brennan had escaped earthly punishment for his crimes, dying peacefully in a nursing home, while his victims' families suffered for decades. Harold Brennan had retired with full pension and honors, his corruption discovered only after his death. There was no satisfying ending to the story, no moment of triumph when evil was defeated and justice prevailed, but there was something else, something more subtle and perhaps more lasting. 7 families had found peace. 7 children had been laid to rest with dignity and love. A community had confronted a terrible truth and chosen healing over hatred. The corruption that had allowed these crimes to go unsolved had been exposed and addressed, making it less likely that such injustices would happen again. Sarah thought about the phone call she'd received that morning from Maria Santos Martinez. Maria was now 84 and facing health challenges, but she'd called to thank Sarah for giving her the chance to finally say goodbye to her daughter. "I can sleep now," Maria had said. "For the first time in 47 years, I can sleep through the night without wondering where my baby is. She's safe now. She's at peace." Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps the real measure of justice wasn't punishment for the guilty, but peace for the innocent. Perhaps the greatest victory wasn't catching the killer, but bringing the children home. Sarah walked back to her car as the sun set over Atlanta, the city lights beginning to twinkle in the growing darkness. Tomorrow there would be other cases, other families waiting for answers, other children who deserved to be found and brought home. The work was never finished, but tonight, 7 families were sleeping peacefully, knowing their children were finally at rest. The bell tower at Cornerstone Baptist Church had been fully restored, its wooden frame reinforced and its exterior painted bright white. The church bell rang every Sunday morning, calling the congregation to worship, its clear tone carrying across the neighborhood like a voice from the past. But now it also served as a memorial, a reminder that even in the darkest places, truth could still be found, and even after decades of silence, justice could still speak. In the end, that might be the most important lesson of all. That love persists beyond death, that truth endures beyond deception, and that even when human systems fail, the human heart continues to seek answers, to demand justice, and to insist that every child, every life matters enough to be remembered, honored, and brought home.